I'm Cham and presenting with me tonight is my colleague Scott Barber. Welcome everyone, and let's begin today's session with this. Let us know in the chat what are your insights. What are the insights do you get from this chart shown here? Okay, looking at the chat. Not a lot. Thanks, Annie. Product tree is different pattern, pretty basic chart. Product tree is different trajectory to the others. It is confusing, yeah. It's not a quick read. Product tree gets better over time. Product tree outperforming the market and so on. So we just saw that for this chart, we have several insights that we have identified. Summarized more by the group. We see that product tree is popular. Why do you think that is? How did we pinpoint those insights? What was our criteria to say that this is significant or relevant? And today, we're gonna talk about how we're gonna learn how to take those insights and craft an impactful story with it. And we begin by telling the right story to the right people. Storytelling is innate to us human and is an art form, I would say, that triggers an emotional response from our audience. Let's take a look at some of the data stories that we have in the wild. In this particular data story published in Axios.com, they explore the periodic nature of cicadas and the co-emerging of cicada broods into the future. I like this example very much as they adequately establish the context and help me learn a lot about cicadas and why coemergences are significant. It's supported by data, it is cohesive and interactive. Overall, it's an informative and entertaining piece. This well-written data story about Asian representation in movies took a more data-driven approach while allowing the audience to explore the data set themselves. So those charts there are interactive. I like how each chart was used to drive a point and was used in building a solid narrative that at the end, if you go to this particular data story, leaves the audience with something to think about. And this data story relates to personal experiences of the author to a research showing that the neighborhood where you grew up in has significant impact on your future economic success. What I love here is how the insights from the research was presented through the author's experiences, and the message was synthesized at the end with a clear visual. So finally, let's take a few minutes to watch or maybe rewatch this iconic 200 countries rather in 200 years by Hans Rosling.
So here we go. First, an axis for health, life expectancy from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an axis for wealth, income per person, $400, $4,000, and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. Here come all the countries. Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East green, Africa south of Sahara blue, and the Americas yellow. And the size of the country bubbles show the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor. Life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only UK and the Netherlands were slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War. and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe! And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up. Brazil was way behind, Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle, but there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China, I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guizhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa.
And yet, despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future. With aid, trade, green technology and peace, it's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner.
Well, what you just seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involved plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?
All right. That was really good. Let's break that example down. So when he said, "So, here we go," immediately the audience was engaged. I assume you guys are engaged. And he swiftly followed it up with a visual mapping of what are the metrics for each of the axes are, what the colors of the bubbles represent, and what the size of the bubbles represent. The narrative was simple and straightforward, but all the points that he mentioned there were all relevant to the story. I loved how the emphasis was given on the effects of the Spanish flu and the First World War. Finally, at the end, we saw an overview of the movements where there was a replay and resolution to where the figures will be most likely in the future. Our own work on a daily basis may require charts like this, what we're showing here, but we can surely pick up some points from the examples that we just saw and make sure that we engage our audience so that they will listen. We craft narratives to help them care and remember our message. With this, we can elevate our charts from the ones in the previous slide to maybe something like this, where the message is broken down, we are taken on a narrative journey, we are invested, hopefully, to see whether the conflict resolves at the end. The takeaway is clear and actionable, and all of those made in an engaging manner. We mentioned that we should make the audience care, but how do we do that? What should we think about to help our audience care? A data story starts with two elements, data and visual. As part of a data story, data visualization takes things that are hard to understand, like a data set of millions of rows maybe, to something accessible, just like this map, something that we as humans can explore, find patterns in, and get insights from. The third element of a data story is context. Understanding who our audience is and outlining our purpose by answering questions such as, why is this visualization relevant? Why is it important to our audience? How will they consume it and where? How long will they interact with it? Is there any other data that we need to further solidify our narrative, and so on? Those questions, when answered, will help us design a relevant and impactful data story. And after context, most essentially, a data story needs a narrative. A narrative is a carefully and thoughtfully laid out path through facts. We are the narrator or the guide. The hero of our story can be our audience or the metric, meaning the dataset that we are working on. Looking back at the Hans Rosling example that we just saw, an engaging narrative invites the audience to be a part of the story, inviting them to explore and bringing them on a journey to the heart of the story so that they'll stick around to see what happens next. Now that we have made our audience care and held them through the door of our story with our narrative, how do we make them stick around? Stickiness is related to the insights that we build our narratives around. So our first task is to find them. And to find them, we need an exploratory approach, and then we can expound on what we found through an explanatory approach. Having identified all these insights, we need to decide what story to tell and what is the hook of our story. A hook is a moment of change. It's an interesting point or an unexpected pattern that we'd like to direct the audience's attention to. Looking back again at the Hans Rosling example, one of the hooks was the emphasis on the effects of wars and pandemics, where we saw the bubbles drop abruptly. If our story doesn't have that hook, that turning point, the data by itself will not tell much of a story. A hook can be having a significant difference in magnitude than was before, or now the values may be diverging or have crossed over, or maybe there's been a change in the rate of the metric that we are working on, or a shift in contribution. Or maybe one of our data points has moved away from the pack and now has become an interesting outlier. However, like data in itself is not a story, a hook by itself is also not a story. The hooks that we found are points in our story is waiting to be structured by a narrative. Now, how do we structure our story? From an early age, we think of story in terms of shapes. Stories are about journey. Think of your favorite movie. A transformation, a change of some kind that drives the narrative. Now, before we proceed, let's head on to the chat and share which story shape would you associate the Hans Rosling example with. Okay, let me see the chat. So we can see here for the shape of stories that we have here that on the horizontal axis, we have the time passing. And on the y-axis, we have the good and the bad times in the story. Some of the examples that we have here, like Cinderella, very popular kind of form. And I think we started with Man in a Hole is also a very common form of story writing. But for today, we're going to stick to something that is very simple, the story pyramid. This pyramid has a start, middle, and end. At the start, we set up the status quo, what's the current situation, and why the conflict exists. The middle is where we present the key insights that we identify as a turning point and elaborate on what changed exactly. And at the end is where we synthesize with the resolution and how things have resolved. And to go from the start to the middle and from the middle to the end, our stepping stones to go from one to the other are our story points. There are different ways to tell a story. Some standalone charts can tell a story by their own, simply by directing the audience's attention. Let's take a look at this example and share on the chat which elements of this chart do you think help direct the story. If you're going to look at this chart, how are you going to read it? Is the title helpful? Were the annotations or all the other notes in the chart in the chart helpful? What do you think are the elements in this chart that helped you build a story with just this single visualization? Let me know in the chat. Annotations, yes, we have a lot for this particular example. Colors, yes, the countries that we have in here are represented by different colors. And what else? Annotation stars, yes, we have it in here. Nationwide lockdowns, very important thing to note, the lockdowns when it did occur, because this is a chart about the coronavirus. Access titles, yes, thank you so much, very good answers. In this particular example, the meaningful title that we have and the use of color, as pointed out, and the context building annotations were also pointed out, help guide the audience through the story, even though this is just a single visualization. Similarly, in this particular example, in the second example, the meaningful title, once again, the use of colors and the simple annotations compared to the previous example help us tell the story. And in this particular example, we can clearly see the story structure with start, middle, where the key insight is, and the end. However, we can also opt to tell the story by breaking it down into separate pieces with multiple slide stories, scrolly telling, and the use of animation and interactive elements. Be it a single visualization or a multiple visualization story, by using a narrative to sequence our story points, we'll be able to tell a cohesive story with a clear message. Going back to our simple story shape and mapping on it our story points, the first one will show where we are now. The fifth or so will highlight or be at the turning point or the climax. And in between these two will fit in the pieces of our narrative to build from the setup to the key insight. And by breaking things down, we make the information that we want to share more digestible while building our audience's interest. And each story points in here represents a chart or a visual that tells its own clear message. Charts that are made mindfully with all its design decisions supporting the message. And hopefully the audience that we took on a journey from the setup at the beginning to the key insight and towards resolution at the end will be compelled to act. A way to make a multiple visualization story effective is by leveraging on interactivity. Interactivity helps the audience move from simply knowing to experiencing the story themselves, discovering the story themselves. And with that, we're able to create rich narratives, just like the examples that we saw earlier on. That builds trust by helping the audience learn, get more context, and explore multiple narrative paths that are available, which puts them at the heart of the story once again, where they hopefully now care more about the story's message. And to ensure that our charts in the story brings home the message clearly, we have the framework for data visualization design that Scott will share with us. The floor is yours, Scott.
Thanks, Cham. That's really great. So we've sort of learnt there about the importance of storytelling. But what you might be thinking is, how do I actually sort of put that into practice with my own work? What are some practical steps we can take to make sure that when we design our data visualizations, they actually support our story? So that's what we're going to go through in this kind of second half. effectively, one way to think about this is that data viz is a game of decisions. So each time you put together a data visualization, you can have lots of different decisions to go through. Some of them are big. So obviously the one we've been talking about now, what's your story? That's a big decision, but there's obviously lots of little ones as well. Do we need tick marks on the chart? And if so, how many? How do we use color? All of those sorts of things. So that's what we're going to be looking at here, how you make those decisions. Often when you go into a data sort of visualization tool, maybe it's Excel, maybe it's Flourish, we have a lot of defaults. So you put your data in and a chart comes out and you've got it kind of as it comes out of the box. And, you know, we here at Flourish and Canva do a lot of work on making sure our defaults are great. But we also do need to think about lots of those decisions as we go through and make them deliberate so that they're really supporting our story and really backing that up. So how does that work? So if we go back to our framework here, we can kind of see an example here. So as we come into the setup here, we're going to be thinking about what kind of chart best supports our story. And then as we get to pointing out the insight, that's maybe where we might use color. And then as we get to the end of the story, we might want to use annotations to really kind of deliver that context and that call to action for our visualization and our story. So to help you do that, what we've done is we've put together a 5-point sort of framework for data viz design. And it goes right from the story, which we've talked about, through the chart, how to use numbers, how to use colors, and how to use labels. So we'll go through those step by step here and perhaps give some examples. So if we start with the story, so we've already kind of gone through this a little bit, but practically in the chart, what we want to make sure is that we're really reinforcing our message. So that can be something as straightforward as making sure that the title really reinforces your message rather than just being a descriptive title that just talks about the data. We also need to think again about our audience. When we put together the chart, you may have been looking at this data for a long time often, and you know a lot of the backstory to it, but do you need to make sure your audience does as well? Are they on the same page as you? And then thinking about context. Cham talked about that quite a bit. You know, is this chart going to sit on its own? Are you going to be talking to it in a presentation? Or has it got text going alongside it in a report? All those things may impact how you think about the decisions you make in your design. It may be that it needs to do all of those things. So let's look at some examples. So this is a great example just on the title. You can see here it's saying exposure to air pollution is highest in parts of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And that really comes across and really sort of points out that data that we're seeing in the chart. So it's really kind of obvious what we're trying to get from that chart. In this example, what we've got here is just some ideas of how the overall design can match your story. So on the left-hand side, that's a good example of perhaps the default chart you would get if you put that data into a tool. And we've got a nice stacked area chart, which is fine. But really, that's going to be the best chart to use if your story is about the total. If your story is actually more about the nuance underneath and the regional patterns, you might want to think about using the chart on the right. You can see, for example, say in the Middle East, if I look at that, you can really see the pattern there, which is much harder to see in the chart on the left. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go through, you'll see this chart quite a few times now, and this is a little bit like that chart we saw right at the start, where it's a kind of default chart. We're not really sure. We probably think that this is something to do with Brunei that the author wants to get us across here, but we're not 100% sure because the chart really doesn't tell us too much. Okay, so when we click through here, what we can see is we've changed from the first one where it's got this descriptive title. So it's just telling us about the data, what it is, to being something that actually tells the story. So now we know the story is about Brunei. It's got the highest CO2 emissions in the Southeast Asia, and it's on the up. So immediately we're kind of getting the story. It's giving us some idea of the story. And then from there, we can start to bring in those other points in the narrative, a bit like Cham was saying, taking you on that journey to then tell you what's the next thing under that. And here we're looking under the surface. Okay, so for story, our top tips would be make sure you write out the main message as your title heading and then use the subtitle to describe the data. Make sure you know your audience and think about that context. Where's this chart going to sit? Okay, so next up, looking at the chart itself. So often the kind of biggest decision, and sometimes maybe the only decision we kind of often make, is what chart type. And that's the one we quite often fixate about. And it is really important. I think the tip we would have there is to really think about what's the relationship you're looking at. If you think back to what Cham was talking about, the hook, what's the kind of part of the data, what's the focus you want to bring the attention to? So if it's a change in ranking, that might be a bar chart or a ranking chart of some sort. And then if you've got maybe two series diverging, then maybe that's going to be a line chart. So you can use that to help you decide what chart would be best. Some other things you maybe need to think about with the chart itself are going to be where it sits. So how does it look on desktop and mobile, if this is going to be something on the web? You might also want to think about whether you can use interactivity or animation to support your story. So one thing also would be the level of detail. So how much detail do you want to put in your chart? And if we think back here to that Hans Rosling example, one of the great things he did was he brought the data in an aggregate form. So we were looking at all of the countries. And then at the end, he looked in at China and kind of started to split it up into different parts. And so that's something you can do here. So in this example, we're looking just at aggregates for different regions, looking at the world's tallest people. But we might want to also break it down into a little bit more detail, give more detail on the individual countries as I hover over here. So depending on your story, you might want to do one or the other, or you might want to walk the user through, giving it to them in steps. Okay, so on that idea of chart choice, so this is a little tool that we've put together. So it's a little bit like the FT's visual vocabulary, and just lets you kind of have that idea of what is it you're trying to do, what's the data, what's the kind of behavior or the pattern in the data that you're trying to show. And so we talked about maybe a ranking. So if we click on ranking here, it can give us some of the kinds of charts and just helps you make that decision. Okay, so now we're back looking at our chart again. So here we've got a line chart, but maybe we could look at this in different ways. Maybe it doesn't need to be a line chart. And in some ways that depends on what your story is. So as I click through, first of all, we might want to break it out into the individual components. So that would perhaps be if your story was more about how the differences are between these individual countries rather than just Brunei. Or we could kind of simplify it. So here we're looking at a slope chart, and we're looking at the start and the end of the data. So just kind of makes it a little bit more straightforward. If your story is really just about the change over that full period, maybe you don't need to see all the wiggles in the line in the middle. Equally, just one more on that one actually, you might want to split it up in this example. Maybe we aren't even looking at the start and the end of the data, and it's a period in between. So here you can see actually we have quite a different story if we take the dates as being 2018 to 2019. And then finally, we might want to, depending perhaps on our audience, use something a little bit more engaging. So here we've used an animated bar chart race to show maybe the ranking changes, particularly in the countries underneath Brunei. Okay, so our chart tips, or top tips for charts. Consider what relationship you want to draw attention to. Try and explore different chart types rather than just going with the first option that comes up. Try a few different things and see which one tells your story best. And then also consider the data structures you're going to need for that chart type. That kind of leads us on to the next section, which is all about the numbers in your chart. So there's a few things here. So I think the first one is the metric you're using. So obviously, when you get your data, you can do things with it. You can take an average, you could look on a year-on-year change. Maybe a different metric will tell your story in a better way. So perhaps the level isn't the thing you want to look at, it's the change. So you can look at different metrics. You can then look at how you order the data. So that is often a really good tip, is just ordering the data makes it more readable and draws out some of the conclusions more easily. And then we get into the kind of idea about how we use the numbers to make the story clearer. So things like making sure the data is clean and accurate is obviously kind of self-explanatory, but we also want to use axes and notes and things to make sure that people can understand what they're looking at. What are the units? What do the numbers mean? You may kind of know because you've been looking at it sort of all day long for a couple of weeks, but make sure your reader can pick that up just as easily. Okay, let's have a look at some examples. So we're back on our Brunei chart again. So can we make a few changes here to make this this more readable? So first of all, here we're going to just put some axes notes on, so it's very clear what these numbers represent. And we've also tidied up along the bottom here these years. We had quite a few more years along the bottom there. What we might also want to do is just put the unit there. So this is in tons. And here what we're doing is we're just going to show you how ordering can be important. So I've split them out again in this grid of charts. And you can kind of see here that we're a bit sort of all over the place. But if I now just reorder them by the data, you can now see it looks kind of more visually appealing, but we also get a bit more information. We now could tell the story about which ones of these are the biggest and the smallest, which we didn't get from the well, very easily from the previous chart. And then finally, talking about metric, here we've just transformed it into a year-on-year change, and you can see potentially we get very different story points out of here. So just make sure we're using the right metric for the story point we want to tell. Okay, so numbers top tip, use the right metric, make sure your axes and grid lines all help you read the chart. Sometimes you might want to take some away, might want to add things in, and then use the order and grouping of the data to best illustrate your story. Okay, so our point 4 is on color. And so color, sometimes we're kind of a little bit hemmed in if we've got a kind of corporate brand or something we need to adhere to, but we can still use color, and it's a really important way of kind of emphasizing our story. And if we go down the list here, we've got things like accessibility is really important, making sure everyone can see the right colors, the type of colors. So we might look at that in a second in terms of how you perhaps use colors to make a scale, so sort of diverging colors perhaps, and then the number of colors, and then how we use them for highlighting. Okay, so you can see here, this is quite a good example about how important color is. We probably would get very different conclusions from looking at the left chart and the right chart. And it's the same data. These points are just the same, but we've just changed how we've adapted the scale here. So that can be really important. Obviously, you want to be kind of truthful and accurate when you're using scales and things, but the way you set this up can tell a very different story. So color can be really important. Okay, so let's go back again to our Brunei chart and see how we could use color here. So as we click through, the first thing we could perhaps do here is to just highlight Brunei, because this is the one we're interested in for our story here. These ones are just kind of the comparisons. So we're going to just put those in gray and put Brunei in blue, and then it really brings out focus on the chart. And what we also did actually, just to go back, is we put Brunei in blue in the header here, really just to kind of tie those two things together when you look at the chart. And then on this example, again, we've used color just to highlight one particular country that we think is the most interesting, and just to really draw your eye to this series. Okay. So color. So using gray for secondary information is a really good tip. Using sort of bold and contrasting colors, and also maintaining consistency. So if you've got a load of slides, and let's say it's countries like we were looking at before, make sure that Brunei is always the same color as you go through that those slides, so that your reader can pick that out very easily. Okay, so we're on to that final one of 5. This is all about labeling. So text obviously is really important. We often think about data visualization as just being about patterns and so on, but the text is really important. So we can think about annotations, titles we've talked about a little bit, but also how we label the axes and so on. Direct labeling of series, so making sure we aren't asking people to do too much work, going back and forth with their eye to a legend, and then how we use pop-ups and footers. Just on this tool we've got here, when you've got the presentation, if you do want to know a little bit more about each one, just hover over these when you've got the presentation, and you'll get a little bit more information. Okay, so this is an example of annotations. And as we kind of flick through on this chart, you can see we added some annotations in here to point out the key points on this line. And so without it, you're kind of asking the user to guess why the lines moved around at different points. It also gives you a bit of context. So you can see, okay, this big move here, how much did that move compared to some other important points back in the future? So annotations can be really useful. So on our chart, let's see how it works. So the first thing is we've talked about putting text onto the chart, but we can also take text off of the chart. So we could also spend quite a lot of time talking about how we declutter charts. And so in this example, we've got a legend here, which we don't really need because we've already nicely labeled our series on the lines here. So we can get rid of that and get rid of a bit of clutter. Getting rid of text can be really important, just means there's less work for the user to do when they come to absorb and read your chart. Okay, so we've taken that away and labeled these lines directly. And now we've put in some nice annotations just to tell the user, when these big moves happened, give them a bit of context about why that happened. Okay, so our label top tips, add annotations and reference lines to draw attention, add labels, and replace legends where you can with direct labeling. Okay. So what we can do now is use that framework to kind of get an idea of how many decisions we made. So we've got our big framework there, and we can kind of think about, how do we think this chart scored on the framework? So I think it probably scored pretty low because this is your default chart. This is where we just put our data in and we just let the tool make all the decisions about how it looked. So that one is going to score pretty low. And then when we get to our final one here, we've made more decisions. We've made more kind of deliberate decisions all around the chart about how it looks. So we've got some scores here. So what we've done, of our 25 potential different decisions, this one we've done 14 out of 25. So that's pretty good. And we can sort of hover through here and work out which ones we've done. So we've done pretty well on the labeling. We've done a lot thinking about that. But there are some elements we maybe still want to think about. We didn't really think at all about whether we could make it interactive. We didn't particularly think about a palette or a brand palette there. So there are still some things to do. Now, this isn't really a score. We're not saying, just because you've kind of done more of these that it's a better chart, but it does help to actually make sure that as you go through, you're being deliberate about all of these design decisions and making sure that they all back up your storyline. Okay, so a little bit of work for you to do in the chat here. I've put up a chart here, and I think this is one where, again, this is a kind of default chart where we've put our data in, and this is what's come out, and we've put a little headline on it. What do we think of this? How do we think we could start to improve this chart using the framework? Can anyone start to put in some ideas, and then we'll perhaps go through what we would do on them. Okay, so we've got reordering the chart. It seems like a good one, absolutely. Highest to lowest. A more specific title, yeah, that's right. That would be really useful because at the moment we don't really know which bit are we supposed to be talking about here, which is the interesting data point. A map, yeah, that could be interesting. So we've got some geographic data here. We don't maybe need all of those grid lines, that's right. There's a lot of clutter on the chart. Add the year, yeah, when are we talking about here? We need a bit more context. Changing the colors, yeah, it's a bit all over the place in terms of color. Do we really need all those different colors? Is that really helping? We could break it down into different areas. So I think everyone's kind of guessing the changes we're going to make here. So you're not going to probably be too surprised as we go through them. So let's start going through some of the changes that we would make to this chart. So first of all, yes, we've got a better title. So we're saying North America has the highest drug use in the world. So immediately we're actually saying, what is it we want the user to get out of this story, or the reader? And then we reordered them, as someone suggested. So now that looks much better. We can immediately tell North America's up at the top. And now we've sorted out that color. So it looks a lot cleaner now. We haven't got the multicolored rainbow chart. And one of the things we've done here, I'm not sure if anyone got this one, but instead of using, people talked about the grid lines and so on, but instead of using a numerical axis along the bottom, we've just labeled each bar here. So now we can immediately tell the number for North America is 3.4, rather than having to read down off of the axis for each individual one. Okay, now we're trying to really emphasize our story. So we've used that color idea of coloring the country or the region we want people to look at, and taking the others down to gray. And then we've also just matched that up in the title, so we can immediately recognize North America as the red bar and being the subject of the story. Okay, and then now people talked about maybe having a bit more of a breakdown. So what we've got here is now we've got the next step on, perhaps in the story, where we dig underneath the surface and work out, okay, which, you know, what's driving this this drug use. And so now we can actually go in here and switch that around and perhaps let the user kind of explore the data if we want them to. Or we could sort of weave that into the narrative. We could tell them why we think that what's driving this. Okay. Okay, so going back to our framework again, you can see we've used now many more decisions than we did on that first initial chart where we just put the data straight in as the default. And I think we can all agree probably we got a much better end result out of that. We would have been able to capture that story much more easily as the reader from that. Okay, so we've been through now some of the practical tips of how you can to craft your and design your visualizations to help tell your story. So we're just going to summarize some of the things we've learned about storytelling. So first of all, what are the benefits? So obviously it makes it a bit clearer and more obvious what you want them to take away as the main data story point. So that's kind of, don't make the reader do the work of trying to guess what your key message is. Really kind of lead them to that decision using your design decisions as you go. Okay, and if you do that, obviously it's going to make it more memorable. So once the kind of user has got that kind of hook, and as Cham was talking about, kind of the emotional part of the story, they're much more likely to remember the insight that you want them to get to. It also makes it more compelling. You're not just kind of putting some facts on the table, you're actually getting them involved and maybe explaining not just the what, but the why. And you've got a kind of more insightful package when you get that kind of aha moment when people think, oh, right, okay, I immediately get what you're talking about there. Okay, so we've boiled all that down. We've talked about a lot. So we've boiled it down, I guess, into 5 key takeaways. The importance of understanding your audience is really key. So just really kind of always thinking about who's going to be looking at this chart and how much do they know about what I'm telling them. Defining the purpose, you know, what is that key point that you want to get out? And then sort of getting that into a plot twist or something that really kind of grabs their attention, breaking it down into story points, and then making sure that all of your design decisions when you actually sit down to create the chart or the visualization do actually support that story. Okay, so if we had to boil it down to one, it's that all design decisions to be made in support of the story we're telling. Okay, so thanks very much, everyone. We've got some extra helpful links and resources here. I think you've already got the link to the presentation, but we're going to be sending that out again. I'm not sure actually, Anne, if we've got some time for some questions, but we can certainly take some questions if anyone's got any thoughts in the chat, and we can get back to you.
We have definitely got a few minutes if anyone has any questions that we can answer, but if you have to head off now, that's okay. We have got an email address that you can reach out to if you don't have time now, but if you could just pop your questions into the chat, we will be able to answer them for you now, hopefully. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and thank you so much, Scott and Cham. That was amazing and so insightful. I think quite a lot of people are leaving, so I'm just going to quickly show you guys the email addresses. And also, actually, next up, our next webinar will be a US election special, all about how to win the audience with interactive visualizations. And we will share the link for that in the email with the recording and the slides here. And yes, if you do have any questions, you can reach out to us at flourish-webinar@canva.com for any webinar specific questions, and hello@flourish.studio for anything else. And our socials are on the bottom if we don't have any time now to get to your questions. But yeah, if there are any questions in the chat, we will try and get to them, but it looks like quite a lot of people have to head off.
There was one question actually on using maps. That's not to put Cham on the spot, but Cham is our maps expert. So the ideas for maps, Cham?
Where was the question actually? Let's try to
I
find
think it was about sort of let's see, They're flying by the questions. So yeah, any tips for data overlaid on maps was the question.
Okay, for that one, well, we have a lot of different kinds of templates in Flourish for maps, and in terms of what the kind of visualization that you're going to use, uh, what kind of map rather you're going to use, it depends on what your data is and the scale of your data. So the challenging part and my experience when dealing with maps is actually dealing with the data first, because you need to have your locations, you need to have your geometries on it. And once you have that, Flourish is very helpful. And we have a lot of templates that you can choose from that already has like meaningful data sets that you can compare if it's the kind of map that you want to create. So my advice is just look at some of the templates that we have and see if it fits your purpose.
Yeah, that's great. And I think Annie's just put in the chat, there is a previous webinar we've done on maps. So that would be a good
That's
sort of
right.
deep dive into that. I think someone else had a question on kind of the one, if we could just have one change, what would we do? Or one kind of tip. And I think that probably would be the one about the title. You know, that's, I think, something, I mean, certainly I've been guilty about it in the past is, you know, when you're in a rush, the title of the chart just becomes the description of the data, and you just kind of think, okay, well, they'll get it, you know, they'll kind of get the point. But I think you are such a useful bit of real estate to put in a title. Sometimes also, you know, people will use kind of catchy titles. I know the economists do that really well, of kind of, you know, like a hook there, something to kind of get you interested in looking at the chart. So it doesn't always have to be the storyline, but I think that is a really useful bit of real estate. So it's kind of a waste just to use it as almost a subtitle.
I think that's a very good point. The title is actually one of the biggest things that you will see on a chart aside from the chart itself. And once you are able to create a title that's meaningful and not just describing the data, as Scott mentioned it, something that tells a story, something that tells that one key takeaway that you want your audience to go home with, then you already did like 50-80% of the job, because that is your core message, that is your key takeaway. And after you are able to iron that title down, I would say that one of the drastic, powerful changes that you can employ in your chart is color. As we have seen in the examples earlier, when you have all of those series with different colors, and then we drill it down to two, because that's the ones that we want to focus on, a specific country and background data set to compare it with. And now we can see the title being reinforced with how we use color to emphasize and highlight in the chart.
Yeah, that's great. I've just spotted one more from Chris, was talking about the particularly the bar chart race, and it kind of potentially being a bit problematic for storytelling because it kind of whizzes by. I think that is right. I mean, one of the things you can do with a Flourish story is to kind of, if you wanted to, you could sort of get it to animate for a bit and then stop, and then you could kind of, you know, build in a little bit of a period there where the user can kind of stop it and look at a certain point. It also has some captions in there, so you can kind of point at things as they go through. You can also slow down the animation a bit, but those are all, yeah, it's a good point. Okay, any more questions?
I think that might be it for questions. Yeah. Okay, so thank you again, everyone, for joining, and thank you again to Scott and Cham for this amazing session. As I said, if you think of anything that we haven't covered here, please reach out to the email addresses onto the screen, and we will be sending out a recording with the link to the slides and the link to sign up for next month's webinar to you by the end of the week. So yeah, have a lovely rest of your week, and thank you so much for joining, everyone.
Thank you so
That's all.
much.
Thank you.